Picture yourself awakening on a cold morning in Paris, 1661. The church bells are ringing, announcing a new era. Young Louis XIV, just 23 years old, has declared he will rule alone, without a prime minister. No one could have imagined that this moment would mark the beginning of history's most powerful absolutist regime, forever transforming the concept of power in Europe. The dawn of that momentous day set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the political landscape of an entire continent. In the narrow cobblestone streets of Paris, as word spread of the young king's declaration, few could grasp the magnitude of this transformation. Here was a king who would become known as the Sun King, whose reign would span an extraordinary 72 years, the longest of any major European monarch. As morning mist cleared over the Seine, Louis XIV was already crafting his vision of absolute monarchy. Through the corridors of power, a new message resonated. L'État, c'est moi. I am the state. These words weren't merely a boast. They represented a fundamental shift in how monarchy would function. The young king, with an almost supernatural self-assurance, was about to embark on a journey that would elevate the French throne to unprecedented heights. In the years that followed, Louis would orchestrate a masterful consolidation of power. He transformed a modest hunting lodge into the magnificent Palace of Versailles, an awe-inspiring symbol of royal authority. Every morning, elaborate ceremonies known as le lever du roi, the king's rising, would see nobles competing for the mere privilege of helping the monarch dress. This wasn't mere vanity. It was a calculated political strategy, keeping the nobility occupied with court rituals while the king strengthened his grip on power. What made this transformation truly remarkable was how Louis XIV wove together political power, divine right theory, and cultural supremacy. Under his reign, France became not just a political powerhouse, but the cultural heart of Europe. The arts, architecture, fashion, and etiquette of Versailles became the standard that every European court sought to emulate. The Sun King's legacy extends far beyond his time. His model of centralized power, state bureaucracy, and political propaganda continues to influence governance even today. Though the sun finally set on Louis XIV in 1715, the brilliant light of his reign continues to illuminate our understanding of power, leadership, and statecraft. This was more than just the story of one man's ambition. It was the dawn of modern state power, a transformation that would echo through centuries of European history, shaping the very foundations of how we understand government and authority today. Want to discover how this moment changed the course of history forever? Hit the bell, like and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles to embark on this unique journey through the modern age. I am the state. These words, attributed to Louis XIV, were far more than a display of royal arrogance. They were a political revolution crystallized in a single phrase. But how did one man manage to concentrate such unprecedented power in his hands? The answer lies in Versailles, and what a story it tells. Picture a modest hunting lodge, the kind where nobles would rest after a day's pursuit of deer and wild boar. Now imagine this humble structure transforming into the most magnificent palace ever built, a meticulous machine of power that would make even the ancient Roman emperors envious. Every stone, every gilded surface of Versailles was carefully chosen to convey a singular message. The king's power was both absolute and divine. The Hall of Mirrors, stretching 357 feet, wasn't just a stunning gallery, it was a masterpiece of political theater. 17 massive mirrors faced 17 equally massive windows, creating an illusion of infinite space and light. As the sun's rays poured through the windows, they reflected endlessly in the mirrors, literally surrounding the king with light. A clever architectural metaphor for the Sun King himself. The gardens, too, told their own story of power. These weren't the natural flowing gardens we might appreciate today. No, these were geometric masterpieces where every tree, every shrub, every fountain was precisely positioned to demonstrate man's, or more specifically, the king's, dominion over nature itself. When foreign ambassadors walked these gardens, they weren't just admiring pretty flowers. They were witnessing a demonstration of the king's ability to command even the natural world to his will. Inside the palace, life revolved around elaborate rituals that would seem almost comical to us today. Even the king's morning routine was a carefully choreographed performance called Le Lever, where dozens of nobles would compete for the honor of helping the king dress. Imagine that, the most powerful men in France fighting over who would hand the king his shirt or hold his morning coffee. But there was nothing comical about the purpose behind these rituals. By keeping the nobility busy with these elaborate ceremonies, Louis kept them away from their own lands and power bases. They were too preoccupied with palace politics to plot against the crown. It was a brilliant strategy, turning potential rivals into willing participants in their own political neutralization. This transformation of a simple hunting lodge into the epicenter of European power wasn't just about creating a luxurious home. It was about crafting a symbol so powerful, so awe-inspiring, that it would make any challenge to royal authority seem not just foolish, but sacrilegious. In Versailles, Louis XIV created more than a palace. He created a physical manifestation of absolute power that would become the model for monarchs across Europe for generations to come. Louis XIV didn't just declare his power, he engineered it with the precision of a master clockmaker. Think of Versailles as an elaborate theatrical production, where every moment of every day was carefully choreographed to reinforce the king's authority. And at the heart of this daily performance was a ceremony so intricate it would make modern-day red carpet events look positively casual. Picture this. It's early morning in Versailles. The most powerful nobles in France are already awake, anxiously waiting outside the king's bedchamber. Why? For the lever, the royal awakening. But this wasn't just about watching the king get dressed. Oh no, this was political theater at its finest. Nobles would literally compete for the honor of handing the king his shirt, helping him with his shoes, or even holding the royal basin for his morning wash. Does this sound ridiculously excessive? That was exactly the point. The Sun King had turned etiquette into a powerful political weapon. Every gesture, every bow, every position in the room was precisely calculated. The right to hand the king his shirt wasn't just about clothing. It was a visible sign of royal favor, watched and envied by the entire court. But here's where Louis's genius truly showed. While these nobles were obsessing over who would have the honor of serving the king his morning coffee, something far more significant was happening. They were absent from their own lands. A duke who spent months at Versailles, competing for the privilege of watching the king eat, couldn't simultaneously be building up his own power base in his home province. The daily schedule at Versailles was exhausting by design. From the morning lever to the evening coucher, the bedtime ritual, nobles were kept busy with an endless series of ceremonies, balls, hunts, and social obligations. There were rules about everything. Who could sit in the king's presence, who could wear what colors, even who could enter which door of the palace. Breaking these rules could mean social disgrace and loss of royal favor. Think about it. If you're a noble spending your days worrying about whether you'll be chosen to hand the king his napkin at dinner, you're probably not plotting rebellion. If you're bankrupting yourself trying to keep up with the latest Versailles fashion, you're not building up your private army. This was social control disguised as ceremony, and it worked brilliantly. The Sun King had created a golden cage, so beautiful and so prestigious that the nobility willingly imprisoned themselves within it. They became so caught up in the game of court politics that they failed to notice how their real political power was slowly slipping away. By the time they realized what had happened, it was too late. The age of the independent noble was over, and the era of absolute monarchy was firmly established. But how could one man claim such extraordinary power? How could Louis XIV justify holding the fate of millions in his hands? The answer came in the form of a revolutionary political theory that would reshape the relationship between heaven and earth, the divine right of kings. Imagine being in a grand cathedral in 17th century France. The air is thick with incense, sunlight streams through stained glass windows, and from the pulpit a priest declares that to disobey the king is to disobey God himself. This wasn't just clever propaganda. It was a carefully crafted theological and political doctrine that transformed monarchs from mere rulers into God's chosen representatives on earth. The theory was brilliantly simple. God himself chose kings to rule. The monarch's authority flowed directly from divine power, making the king answerable to God alone. Think about the implications. If you questioned the king's decisions, you weren't just challenging a political leader, you were challenging God's will itself. It was a masterful fusion of political power and religious authority that made resistance not just treasonous, but sacrilegious. Louis XIV's court became a machine for promoting this divine connection. Artists painted the king as Apollo, the sun god. Playwrights portrayed him as a demigod, walking among mortals. Musicians composed operas celebrating his divine mandate. Every form of artistic expression was mobilized to reinforce one message: the king's power was sacred and absolute. The church naturally played a crucial role in this grand performance. Bishops and priests preached the divine right doctrine from their pulpits. Religious ceremonies were transformed into displays of royal power. Even the king's morning routine became a quasi-religious ritual, with nobles competing to witness what they called the sacred moment of the king's awakening. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect was how this theory changed the very nature of rebellion. Before the divine right doctrine, opposing the king was a political crime. Now it became a sin against God himself. It was a revolutionary idea that transformed political dissent into heresy, making it far more dangerous and far less likely. The brilliance of the divine right theory lay in its simplicity and its totality. It answered every question about royal authority with a single, unassailable source: God himself. Who gave the king his power? God did. Who could judge the king's actions? Only God could. Who could rightfully resist the king's will? No one, unless they dared to claim they knew God's will better than his chosen representative on earth. This wasn't just political theory. It was a complete reimagining of power, authority, and the relationship between heaven and earth. And while we might smile today at the idea of kings ruling by divine right, in its time, it was a revolution in thought that helped build the modern state. While the nobles were busy dancing and gossiping in the glittering halls of Versailles, Louis XIV was quietly orchestrating perhaps his most brilliant innovation: a revolution in how France was governed. Behind the scenes of elaborate balls and royal ceremonies, a new kind of power was taking shape: the modern administrative state. Picture this. In the dusty provinces of France, far from the sparkle of Versailles, a new figure appeared in towns and villages: the intendant. These weren't your typical noble administrators born to power and privilege. No, these were professional administrators, carefully chosen men whose loyalty lay with one person alone: the Sun King himself. The intendants were Louis's eyes and ears across France. They collected taxes, administered justice, managed public works, and reported everything directly back to Versailles. Think of them as the king's personal troubleshooters, part governor, part spy, part tax collector, all wrapped up in one efficient package. But here's what made this system truly revolutionary. For the first time in French history, your ability, not your birthright, determined your position. Many intendants came from the middle class, the so-called noblesse de robe, nobles of the robe. These were educated men who bought their positions and proved their worth through competence rather than inheritance. It was merit-based governance in an age of inherited privilege. The results were astounding. Tax collection became more efficient, much to the peasants' dismay. Roads and bridges were built and maintained. Laws were enforced more consistently. For the first time, France had a professional civil service that could actually get things done. Consider this fascinating detail. Louis created specialized councils for everything: finance, commerce, war, foreign affairs. Each council had to submit regular reports, creating a paper trail that would make modern bureaucrats proud. The king himself would spend hours reading these reports, often making detailed notes in the margins. This wasn't just busy work. This was the birth of modern governmental administration. But perhaps the most clever aspect of this system was how it undermined the traditional nobility. While the old aristocrats were preoccupied with court etiquette at Versailles, these new administrative professionals were slowly but surely taking over the real business of running the country. The nobles kept their titles and their prestige, but the actual power was shifting to a new class of professional administrators. This administrative revolution had another unexpected effect. It created a standardized French state. Before Louis XIV, France was a patchwork of different laws, customs, and privileges. After his reforms, there was one law, one tax system, one administration, all centered on Versailles and all serving the king's will. The Sun King had created something entirely new, a kingdom run not by hereditary nobles, but by professional administrators. It was a system so effective that it would survive the French Revolution itself, forming the backbone of modern France's legendary bureaucracy. What do you think about this administrative revolution? How did this system of professional bureaucrats change the nature of government? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that notification bell to catch our next episode, where we'll explore even more fascinating aspects of how Louis XIV transformed France forever. On September 1st, 1715, as dawn broke over Versailles, the Sun King finally set. After an astounding 72 years on the throne, the longest reign of any major European monarch, Louis XIV drew his last breath. But while the king died, the France he created would live on, fundamentally transformed by his vision and ambition. Think about this for a moment. When Louis took the throne as a child in 1643, France was a patchwork of competing powers. Nobles, church officials, and regional parliaments all vied for control. By the time of his death, he had crafted something entirely new, a centralized state where all power flowed from a single source. It was nothing short of a political revolution. The France Louis left behind was unrecognizable from the one he'd inherited. Where once nobles had maintained private armies and practically ruled as kings in their own territories, now they competed for the privilege of helping the king dress in the morning. Where once tax collection was irregular and inefficient, now a sophisticated bureaucracy ensured the state's coffers remained full. This wasn't just a change in government, it was a complete reimagining of how a state could function. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Louis's legacy was how his model of kingship spread across Europe. From Prussia to Russia, from Sweden to Spain, monarchs scrambled to copy the Sun King's formula for success. They built their own versions of Versailles, established their own centralized bureaucracies, and attempted to recreate the glittering court culture that Louis had perfected. Here's a delicious irony. Even Louis's greatest enemies couldn't help but imitate him. William of Orange, who spent years fighting against French power, copied Louis's gardening style. Peter the Great of Russia, who feared French influence, still modeled his court on Versailles. The Sun King's cultural dominance was so complete that opposing him meant, paradoxically, becoming more like him. Consider this remarkable detail. When Louis died, every European court went into mourning, even those that had fought against him for decades. They weren't just mourning a man, they were paying tribute to someone who had redefined what it meant to be a monarch. Louis's impact went far beyond politics. Under his reign, French became the language of diplomacy and culture throughout Europe. French fashion, art, architecture, and etiquette became the standards that everyone tried to emulate. Even today, when we think of refined taste and elegant style, we often unconsciously reference the standards set during Louis's reign. The Sun King's greatest achievement wasn't just that he created an efficient centralized state. It was that he made such a state seem natural and inevitable. He transformed the very idea of monarchy from a traditional form of rule into something approaching a science of government. When Louis famously declared, "I am the state," he wasn't just making an arrogant boast. He was describing a new reality he had created, where the monarch wasn't just the head of state, but was the living embodiment of the state itself. This concept would dominate European political thought for generations to come. As the sun set on that September evening in 1715, it marked the end of an era, but the light of Louis's reign, his ideas about power, his vision of monarchy, his model of statecraft, would continue to illuminate European politics for centuries to come. In many ways, we're still living in the shadow of the Sun King's legacy. The greatest testament to Louis's achievement might be this. Even after the French Revolution swept away the monarchy he had built, many of the institutions and systems he created survived. The centralized state, the professional bureaucracy, the idea of France as a cultural leader, all these outlived the regime that created them. In the end, the Sun King's most lasting legacy wasn't the absolute monarchy he perfected, but the modern state he helped create. You might think that the age of absolute monarchy is ancient history, gathering dust alongside powdered wigs and silk stockings. But look closer at our modern world, and you'll find Louis XIV's fingerprints everywhere. The Sun King may have left us 3 centuries ago, but his shadow stretches into our present in ways that might surprise you. Think about modern government buildings, those imposing structures of power that dot every capital city. Their grand architecture, their symmetrical designs, their message of authority through magnificence, all of these trace their lineage back to Versailles. When 20th century dictators built their massive administrative palaces, they were unconsciously following a blueprint laid down by the Sun King. Consider how modern governments manage their image. Those carefully staged photo ops of presidents and prime ministers, the meticulously managed public appearances, the strategic use of media to project power. Louis XIV wrote this playbook. He understood something fundamental about power. It's not just about having it, it's about being seen to have it. His mastery of political theater and propaganda would make today's spin doctors envious. Here's something fascinating. When you file your taxes or deal with government bureaucracy, you're interacting with a system that Louis XIV helped pioneer. The idea of a professional civil service, of government departments with specialized functions, of standardized procedures and documentation, these weren't just innovations, they were revolutions in how states operate, and they're still with us today. But perhaps the most intriguing parallel lies in how modern states centralize power. When a national government overrules local authorities, when federal law trumps state law, when capital cities dominate their nations, we're seeing echoes of Louis's great project of centralization. He didn't just build a centralized state. He created a template that future governments would follow for centuries. Even our modern celebrity culture owes something to the Sun King. The careful management of public image, the cultivation of fashion trends, the use of lifestyle as a tool of influence. Louis XIV understood these concepts centuries before. Instagram influencers made them their bread and butter. When we talk about influencers today, we're really describing a modern version of what Louis pioneered at Versailles. And let's talk about bureaucracy. Yes, that seemingly dull but essential feature of modern life. Every time you encounter a standardized form, a government department, or an official procedure, you're experiencing a system that evolved from Louis's innovations. He transformed government from a personal affair into a professional system. For better or worse, we're still living with that transformation. Even modern diplomacy bears his mark. The concept of permanent embassies, diplomatic protocols, international negotiations conducted in formal settings, these were all refined, if not invented, during his reign. When world leaders gather for summits today, they're following diplomatic traditions that would have been familiar to Louis's ambassadors. Perhaps most surprisingly, our modern understanding of the state itself as something distinct from the person who leads it paradoxically emerged from Louis's insistence that he was the state. The sophisticated administrative machinery he built to control his kingdom eventually evolved into the modern bureaucratic state, outliving the absolute monarchy that created it. The sun that supposedly never set finally did set, but its light continues to illuminate our understanding of power, governance, and authority today. When we look at modern governments, celebrity culture, bureaucracy, and diplomacy, we're often seeing the long shadow of the Sun King's legacy. So next time you're stuck filling out government paperwork, dealing with bureaucratic procedures, or watching carefully staged political events, remember, you're experiencing the modern evolution of systems that a French king perfected more than 3 centuries ago. The Sun King may be gone, but we're still living in the world he helped create. Want to explore more fascinating connections between past and present? Like this video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more exclusive content and deep analysis. See you in our next episode, where we'll uncover more hidden threads connecting our world to its remarkable past.